For joining us. I'm Diane. A grand jury's decision in the Eric Garner case incites a second night of outrage around the country. The U.S. economy adds more than 300,000 jobs, and Ashton Carter is set to become the next Secretary of Defense. Here for the week's top national stories on the Friday News Roundup, Margaret Tollett of Bloomberg, Jeff Mason of Reuters, and Nia Malika Henderson of The Washington Post. And since it's Friday, you can watch a live video stream of the program on our website, drshow.org. Of course, you can join us by phone, 800-433-8850. Send us an email to drshow@wamu.org. Follow us on Facebook or send us a tweet. And what it
has been.
Definitely.
And we've got lots of news to cover, but Jeff Mason, let's start with these job numbers, a huge gain. How do you account for it?
A huge gain for the economy. It's a huge gain politically as well for President Obama, who's been trying to show that his policies have been favorable to the economy. It's something that the White House will certainly welcome. 321,000 jobs added last month, which will mean essentially that this year, 2014, could continue to be the strongest month in more than 15 years of job creation.
Am I wrong? Isn't there also a tiny increase in wage gain here, Nia?
Yeah, there is. And we hadn't really seen that before. If you looked at the job numbers before, there just been very modest increases in terms of the take-home pay and what people are finding in their pockets. And that was one of the reasons why people weren't really feeling what was essentially pretty good job news over the last couple of months. But there is a difference. This year comes a little late for the president. He can't campaign on this.
Too late.
Yes. Too little, too late in terms of that, but certainly good news.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, if the Democrats could have had this in August or September, Mary Landrieu might not be in trouble right now. It could be a completely different game. The Republicans, maybe they lose a bit of an issue to talk about, although right now they seem pretty intent on taking immigration into the new year anyways. Jobs are very good. Jobs and wages are very good to campaign against, but once you start the governing process, they have their sights set on something else anyway.
All right.
Unemployment staying at 5.8%. So
right.
Still a very strong number.
Still very strong number, and best gain since the 90s.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's turn to the Eric Garner grand jury result, Nia, and the after.
I think the New York Daily News sort of summed it up best. They had a cover after this happened, and it was "We Can't Breathe." And it was very much a play on what you heard from Eric Garner in those moments as he lay dying on a sidewalk in front of a store in Staten Island.
A cartoon by Bill Bramhill, the New York Daily News, which is Lady Justice lying on her back saying, "I can't breathe."
Right. And this has taken on a sort of a rallying cry now, not only on Twitter, but some of the protesters lying down in some public venues in New York. And you've seen a real spate of a real peaceful protest for the most part, particularly in New York, and rare bipartisan agreement that this was something shocking, unexpected. Charles Krauthammer, who's a conservative columnist, called it outrageous, the decision to not indict this officer. Here we as a country saw this video and what looked to most people as excessive and unnecessary force for a guy who was selling single cigarettes.
So what did the grand jury not see that we all saw, Jeff?
Well, and that's the big question. Basically, they said there wasn't enough evidence to indict him. But the issue of the video is what's so critical to this story. We all saw it. That video, it testifies to the importance of social media again, of everyone having iPhones or cameras on their phones. Everybody saw that. Everybody saw that he was choked. Everyone heard him say, "I can't breathe." So that's the question. What was it that they viewed differently, or what was the evidence that made them decide we don't need to go any further?
But you're seeing now, sort of outside the legal system, or at least outside the central part of the legal system, this recognition by politicians and by, attorneys general, that there needs to be some re-education of police across the country. Bill de Blasio can say something that it's harder for President Obama to say, which is that brown people and black people's lives have the same value as white people, to say it very directly in stark language like that. And coming on the heels of Ferguson, of coming at the same time as these incidents like in Cleveland, it's the kind of aggregate effect of these instances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the chief of police, we must say, in New York said on camera, the mayor is throwing us under the bus.
Yeah, and this goes back to the campaign really that Bill de Blasio had. He had never necessarily had such a close relationship with police there. Campaigned against stop and frisk policy in New York that has since been rolled back. So that's not necessarily surprising. I think other mayors, particularly Rudy Giuliani, probably had a better relationship with the police. But you're going to see some tension there going forward, because Bill de Blasio, in his statement after this non-indictment came out, talked about black and brown communities and the way this decision has landed. And in fact, it's landed cross-culturally. If you look at those protesters, very much cross-racial outrage over this. I think from the president, you've seen him not necessarily do what some might want him to do, which is give a big speech on race or travel to Ferguson or travel to Staten Island, but really look at policy. One of the things he wants to do is give $75 million for these cameras. Body cameras, 50,000 body cameras. The irony there is that it looks like, and we don't know this for certain, but the grand jury watching this video, it seems like the video might have been the best evidence for a non-indictment, that they may have seen that video and in fact read it as a reason to not indict
I don't
him.
understand. How can that be?
I don't think we don't know yet, but I'm sure that was central to the evidence.
But
and they saw it differently.
Here's the crux of the matter, is that virtually all of us have cell phones with cameras. So we can see what's happening. Shouldn't the police be equipped in the same way so that at least they can put forward their version of it?
Indeed, and that's certainly the president's argument and the White House's argument. And there is evidence to show that police officers who are equipped with such cameras, that regions that have that type of equipment and technology, that the crime rate goes down, and that the not just the crime rate, but the incidence of these types of
Criminal
things go down.
Yeah, against them. Yeah.
Ironically, I think there used to be this notion that a gun was a person's best form of self-defense, but maybe now a phone with a video camera.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
Margaret, the Justice Department has announced its findings into police use of force in Cleveland, where the 12-year-old with the toy gun. I mean, these incidents are mounting up.
At least they appear to be. I mean, our knowledge of them and the sort of video and sort of witnessing to back it up are mounting. And it comes at a really interesting time as Eric Holder prepares to leave, as the president's choice for a new attorney general comes in, and of course her very interesting background, the fact that she is going to be, whether she's centrally involved in this case in New York. And it comes at this real time of reckoning, comes towards the end of the second term of America's first Black president. It is a very emotionally charged subject.
So where does the Garner case go from here? Civil rights?
Yeah, I mean, there'll be an investigation into that. And as Margaret said, Loretta Lynch will be in charge of it. She has a history doing this. So some of the most high-profile cases of police brutality, Abner Louima and Amadou Diallo, she was in the department then and so involved with those cases. And it'll probably be part of her questioning when she comes before the Senate in January.
Could that somehow affect members of Congress' attitude toward her?
What's interesting is you've heard some people say, particularly on the House side, that there need to be hearings into what has happened into these in these cases. And you've heard some folks, particularly John Cornyn, say that he doesn't feel like the federal government necessarily should have a role in these state and local matters. So she'll probably be questioned about that. What does she think is the proper role of the federal government in oversight? So whether or not it'll ultimately affect what whether or not she's able to be confirmed, it's hard to say.
Jeff?
The president clearly believes the federal government deserves to have a role. And I think his remarks this week also showed a decrease in patience over the fact that events like this continue to happen. He said, when anybody in this country is not being treated equally under the law, that is a problem. And it's my job as president to help solve it. So I think that suggests that he will want his Justice Department, both now under Holder and in the future under Lynch, if she's confirmed, to be very aggressive.
How long do you expect these protests to go on, Margaret?
Boy, it's such an interesting question. I mean, to some extent, it depends on like what else happens. These things have been very driven by news on the heels of news on the heels of news. And if we get through the holiday season without another major incident like this, without, rioting and civil unrest, then it may sort of subside for a while.
And we should point out that the Reverend Al Sharpton held a press conference. He said there is going to be a national march against police violence on December 13th. Short break, right back. Anderson of the Washington Post, Margaret Talleb, Bloomberg News, and we are still awaiting the announcement from the White House as to the appointment of Mr. Carter to be the next Secretary of Defense. We are told that Chuck Hagel is not going to attend.
A little bit of intrigue.
Yes, intrigue, and certainly indicative of the terrible relationship that he had with this White House. Some might say it's a bit of a churlish move not to show up for what is essentially sort of a transition of power from him to Ashton Carter. But, he was never able to break into that inner circle.
Tell me what we know about Ashton Carter, Margaret.
Yeah, on the face of it, he seems like this sort of boring, safe pick, but he's really nice, like a fascinating guy. He's a medieval scholar. He's a theoretical physicist. In just sort of doing my reading up on him, learning that he'd gotten fired from his first job at a car wash as a child. I mean, it's like there's kind of more to this guy than meets the eye. And what makes sense about him not politically, but just sort of on the merits, even though he doesn't have combat experience, he's not a military guy by background, is that he understands the Pentagon in and out. He's been the number 2 guy. He's been underneath that, the leading acquisitions guy at a time when what's been important and essential about the military has changed. He's an expert on nuclear power at a time when we're negotiating with Iran and have these major sort of issues with Israel and Pakistan. So on many of those levels, he really understands, if not the psyche of, a ground troop, then at least how the place operates. And then enough Republicans like him on the Hill that he can probably close the deal, which is like, this is not a fight Obama.
He had no trouble getting confirmed for his previous defense jobs, and that's clearly something that is important to the White House now, because there will be a Republican-controlled Senate next year when he's up for confirmation hearings, and they want somebody who is going to be easier to confirm. I would like to go back just briefly to the Hagel thing. The White House put out a statement on embargo last night for reporters to go up this morning, which many of us reported that both Hagel and Carter would be there. So it was clearly a surprise to the White House as well that Secretary Hagel decided not to show.
What was the problem with Chuck Hagel?
Well, there were sort of end of the year or meetings that President Obama had, and this was reported by Glenn Thrush in Politico, meetings that he had with Hagel, where he essentially wanted him to lay out a vision for the remaining 2 years, and he came across as sort of lackluster. And if you remember in the Hagel confirmation hearings, he was also a bit lackluster. He had been derided by some in the president's inner circle as something of a paper tiger, and they felt like in this transition, because if you remember, before the president was sort of Robert Gates is sort of a continuation of the Bush policy in some ways, winding down those wars, but in some ways continuing some of them. And then you bring Hagel in, and Hagel really has to wind these wars down. But now we're on a different footing, right?
And this has always been a little bit specious, right? I mean, they were always looking for the guy who looked like they were being bipartisan when they knew they were going to run the whole deal out of the National Security Council anyway. And for Chuck Hagel, when you've been, a decorated veteran, when you've had a long storied career as a senator, when you made waves by speaking out against your own party and backing Obama as a candidate, to be treated that way, to be marginalized and then kicked on your way out the door, like, I'm not sure I'd show up for, the passing over of the torch either. It was not the classiest set of events in the last couple of weeks.
Well, it will be interesting when it finally happens, and we'll be sure to let you know. We finally saw some movement in the lame duck Congress this week, Margaret, renewing tax breaks. What does the House bill entail?
Well, these are like more than 50 breaks. They kick them over into next year, and it's kind of a win-win in the sense that Democrats wanted a wind energy tax credit that gets carried over, and Republicans don't want to be accused of, making life difficult for corporate interests and sort of core parts of their constituency. It's nice that they can get something bipartisan done, but I don't think that this is like something we can take the ball and run with into the new year in terms of the way everything else is going to operate. But it's a real grab bag of stuff, right?
Yeah, it's a grab bag of stuff. Folks in states that don't have taxes will get some breaks. Homeowners will get some breaks.
Let me interrupt you to finally say that President Obama, with Ashton Carter on one side, Vice President Biden on the other, is finally doing the nominating. So we'll go from there.
Yeah, I guess Hagel would maybe, if he were there, he'd be next to Biden or something. But
Conspicuously absent.
Yes, very conspicuously.
It was like watching the Food Network in pair of sweatpants. He's like, have a nice day, guys.
He's going to fire off some tweets soon, I'm sure. So do you want to talk about Carter, or you want to talk about the tax breaks?
No, let's talk about the tax breaks.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this is only, this is going to carry out until December 31st. It's not, and so people who file in April will be able to have these tax breaks. It's not clear that it's going to go beyond that. So in some ways, it's great that it's bipartisan and they're coming together to do these things, to do something. But again, it's this Congress that is only able to play really small ball.
But the Senate is not going to fight it.
Right.
This will happen.
Yeah,
it checks the box so that returns in the spring are are not that cumbersome to file, but it really doesn't resolve these long-term
Yeah.
infighting.
And it's going to add to the budget deficit as well.
Grab bag
42
is
billion.
also
Yeah.
quite interesting who it includes. I mean, it includes NASCAR drivers, it includes banks, it includes investment firms, but it was definitely a bipartisan vote, 378 to 46.
So President Obama says he still wants to pursue a larger package of reviving tax breaks through 2015. Any chance of that before the holidays?
The immigration
You all
debate,
look
it's
so
Before the
tired.
holidays? That's hard.
I think before holidays, there's very little chance.
little.
I think
Yeah.
next year is very hard.
I think
I
so
agree.
too. Yeah.
And yet it is something that both the White House and the Republicans have said they'd like to work on. So I think, you will continue to hear tax reform along with trade being things that maybe there's room for bipartisan agreement on in those first few months of 2015 before the political campaign really sucks all of the oxygen out of Washington.
All right. And Jeff Mason, what about the lawsuit that 17 states have brought against President Obama on his executive action on immigration? What happens now?
Well, it was bound to happen. Obviously, the Republicans in general were very upset by what the president did. And this lawsuit, led by the Texas Attorney General, who is about to become governor, basically will be the strongest way for Republicans to go into court and say what the president did was wrong. Their argument is that he overstepped his authority. They're also arguing that what he has done will lead to an increase in illegal immigrants coming up through the southwest border. And basically, this is their chance to do that and to try and get a court to say the president went too far.
All right. And do let me remind folks that if you like, you can watch today's program in this hour going to drshow.org and click on Watch Live. That's where we are. We're watching live. So what will the president's executive action on immigration do?
Well, it is going to allow, it's basically going to allow, I think the numbers are unclear, maybe upwards of 5 million people, the ability to stay here. And sort of, everybody talks about the folks who are illegal immigrants living in the shadows, right? And they're afraid that someone's going to come, an immigration official will come and knock on their doors and deport them. Basically, for the next 3 years, for a certain segment of illegal immigrants, something like 5 million, which would be half of the 11 million, to stay here for 3 years and be allowed to work. One of the things that's what it's going to mean practically for people, and politically, it's going to mean a whole heck of a lot of things, including this lawsuit where you're going to have governors, particularly from states like Indiana, Wisconsin, Louisiana. These are people, governors who will probably run for president in 2016. It'll be part of that. And it's going to mean that Republicans have to find an answer and a response to what he's doing.
Here's what I want to understand. Does this lawsuit really have merit? Or is it grandstanding on the part of these governors? What do you think?
I think that question is hard to answer at this point. I mean, I think the fact that they have 17 states with Texas that have signed on to it means they think they've got merit. But there are different views on both political sides of this issue as to whether or not the president went too far, whether the president had the legal authority to take this executive action or not. And so the place to decide that is the courts. And that's why they're deciding to do that.
More so than not, the consensus leans toward the president having studied this and kind of drawn the parameters in a way that would withstand a legal fight. So it's kind of a Hail Mary with no downside, according to the calculation of the people who filed the lawsuits, because it tend to be like Republican governors in states where the prevailing public opinion is that illegal immigration is a problem and the president overstepped his bounds. So if they lose, it makes it much more difficult for Republicans in Congress to to be taken seriously with efforts to try to roll this back that way. I
Mm.
mean, that's a bit of the gamble. But on the other hand, that's okay as far as John Boehner and Mitch McConnell are concerned, because they don't want to have this fight anyway. Boy, they really don't want to have
Yeah.
this fight.
And they probably look back, a lot of these governors, at what happened with the Affordable Care Act, right? It looked like a Hail Mary to take this thing to the Supreme Court. And so far, they've had some success, and the Supreme Court now is going to hear another case involving the Affordable Care Act. It's apples and oranges in
Yeah,
some ways,
sure.
but it's certainly a precedent in terms of the way they feel like they can go about
But
this.
if the president's move stands and isn't knocked down by a court, and Congress doesn't repeal it, and even if they did, he could veto it. So anyway, if the president's thing stands, then what's the calculation for Republicans running for president in 2016 for a nominee? They will be asked publicly by immigrant advocacy groups, by groups representing Latino voters, to say, for the record, what they're going to do about the president's policy. And it's just hard to imagine that would be a winning strategy to say, yeah, I'm going to repeal that on day one. Then you can write off a huge block of that vote. And so that was the president's calculus in taking his step. And this lawsuit is maybe, as far as pawns on a chessboard go, the move that made the next most amount of sense as a barometer for how to proceed.
All right, and before we open the phones, let's talk about the Supreme Court case that addresses discrimination in the workplace against pregnant women. Peggy Young, former UPS driver, became pregnant. She was advised by her doctor not to lift more than 20 pounds. UPS told her she'd have to take a leave of absence. They did hold her job. Nevertheless, she lost her salary. She lost her health insurance for that period of time. What did you make of the arguments before the court?
I mean, it's really like a sort of call to arms by women workers all around the country, right? This has massive implications for businesses. The more and more that women are in the workforce, not just, sort of to supplement family incomes, but as chief family earners, as equal participants, as rising up through the ranks, as having lifting jobs as well as kind of secretarial jobs. These are issues that American society has not had to confront. You cannot imagine this being treated this seriously or having as much impact economically in, 1978 or even 1990.
Especially when UPS apparently, under this same law, could allow a driver who was arrested on drunken driving charges.
But there are not as many of those.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's notable that UPS has now changed its policy starting January 1st.
Exactly.
This is changes policy. And Margaret's exactly right. I mean, there's a whole culture of talking about women now and women's rights in a way that there hadn't been in the 60s and 70s. 6 in 10 women will get pregnant while they're working.
Exactly. And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. And remember, you can see the show live going to drshow.org. Let's open the phones now. First to Thomasina in Ormond Beach, Florida. Hi, you're on the air.
Hey, Diane, thanks for taking my call.
Certainly.
Regarding the tragic case of Eric Garner, I believe some police have anger issues and are too aggressive. I believe most cops are good cops. My dad is deceased now, but after he joined the New York Police Department in 1953, he was concerned even back then that there wasn't enough psychological profiling of new recruits. And I'll give you a quick example. When George Zimmerman was on trial, a policeman testified that Zimmerman applied for the police force in Sanford, but he was turned down because he had a bad credit rating. But when the trial was over, it came out that the reason Zimmerman gave on his application for wanting to be a policeman was, and I quote, "I wanted to hunt the bad guys." That speaks volumes.
All right. Thanks for your call. Any comment?
Well, I think the culture is one of the things that the politicians in this debate want to affect and want to change. That is absolutely a concern, and it's a concern that's illustrated by the number of events like this that continue to happen. And I think that's why you'll be seeing people both at the national and the local level continue to talk about it, and why you're seeing protests not just in New York, but in states all across the country.
All right. And to Paul in Houston, Texas, you're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call, Diane.
Sure.
About 15 years ago, I was called to serve on a grand jury in Houston. And when I got into the jury box to be questioned, there were two things that stuck out to me. The first one was that unlike a civil trial, where both the defense and the defendant and the plaintiff's attorneys get to question the potential jurors, when you're selecting a grand jury, the only one there is a prosecutor, and there's no representative of the defense bar to participate in that questioning.
Right.
So that stacks the deck to begin with. But the second thing was, the judge said to the people in the jury box, how many of you have as a relative a police officer? And he defined what a relative was, and about a quarter to a third of the people stood up, and he asked them whether they thought, given the fact that they had a police officer as a relative, that they could be impartial and dispassionately judge the credibility of a police officer if he was a witness before the grand jury. And one of them said he wouldn't be able to do that. So one of your guests said, what was it that the grand jury saw that the rest of us didn't see? And the answer is nothing. It's like the O.J. Simpson trial. We all looked at the same facts, and depending upon whether you were black or white, you came to a different conclusion.
All right, we'll leave it at that and come back and talk about our callers' statements. Short break. Do join us, 800-433-8850. And welcome back. Before we move to responses to our callers' points, I want to correct myself. Ted in Phoenix, Arizona, sent in the correction. I had said it was the New York Police Commissioner William Bratton who said that Mayor Bill de Blasio had thrown the police under the bus. In fact, it was the NYPD union leader, Pat Lynch, who made that comment. Commissioner Bratton has publicly defended the mayor against Mr. Lynch's claim. So I thank you, Ted in Phoenix, for that correction. Now to you, Jeff Mason, on our caller's comment.
So the caller raised the question of how we view things that happen from a paradigm or a view of race. And I think it's important to note in this particular case how the grand jury was made up. It was apparently about half of the grand jury was made up of people who were white. The other half was divided between Hispanics and blacks. 12 of the grand jury had to vote in favor of this in order for the decision to be made. So
how many are on the grand jury? We don't know.
Not exactly sure, but I think 12 is a majority, but certainly not. It's not unanimous. So, I think it raises questions, legitimate questions about how this was viewed when it comes down to race.
Margaret.
I mean, bias is such a complicated thing, and there are some, studies that would lead us, that suggests certainly that law enforcement are more likely to view young black men as older than they really are, as more threatening than they really are, particularly if those officers are white. I mean, this is like incredibly complicated stuff. And one of the earlier callers had said she thinks most law enforcement officers, are basically good people. And of course, I think that's true. I remember being like a cub reporter and going out on a ride along with the local police, kind of like police academy for reporters kind of thing, was sort of a gimmick. And we practiced like a stop and frisk. Obviously, it was not armed in any way. But I remember having that surging experience of being like, essentially, I pulled a fake gun on someone who wasn't threatening as part of this exercise, which happened to every reporter who did this police camp. And the purpose of it was to illustrate that that it's very hard to be a policeman because you become, a lot of times afraid in a situation where you're challenged, and then the person ends up not really being the threat that they seem to be. I mean, this was 20 years ago that I had this experience. I've always remembered that. I think these actions usually don't come from a bad place, but it doesn't matter. If you kill somebody who actually posed no threat to you at all, that's wrong. That's bad.
Let me tell you briefly about an experience I had just 2 weeks ago. I was driving to work, came to a four-way stop, came to a complete stop. There was a police car that had just pulled up on the right, coming from the intersection. I waited a moment, and then I went. Immediately, that police car came behind me with lights flashing.
Yeah, and probably,
And I pulled over and stopped. 2 African-American policemen came out of the car, one a female, one a male. Both came out of the car. The male on the right side of the car peering into my car, the female on the left side of the car looking at me saying, "You realize that we had the right of way." I said, "I'm sorry, did I come to a full stop?" And she said, "Yes, but you should have let us go." I point this out not because I'm doubting the rule, but why did it take 2 members of the police force to stop me for that?
Right. And what, exactly. And that's sort of at the heart of the Garner case in some ways too. Like, here's a guy who is really posing no threat. I mean, he's literally selling single cigarettes. Why do they have to engage with him so aggressively? And I'm sure when you got stopped by the cops, your heart was racing.
Beating.
Your heart was racing. Maybe
what did I do?
And it was sort of a misreading of signs that's going on there. And, thankfully.
So somebody on the right, I guess, always has the right of way. Always.
But this question of overreaction was central sort of to the Ferguson debate as well, which was President Obama's, vow to sort of study the militarization of local police forces in the wake of 9/11. The problem was, in that case, he studied it and studied it and studied it and concluded that more study is necessary.
Exactly. All right, let's go to Frank in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Hi, you're on the air.
Hi, Diane. Thanks for taking my call. Love your show.
Thanks.
Just wanted to offer a technical point. I'm a former Army Ranger, and I've been involved in combatives for a long time. And in reviewing the film, there's two kinds of chokes. There's a blood choke where you compress the arteries and then the person passes out, in which case they can speak the whole time because you're not affecting the voice box. The other type of a choke is an air choke where you actually crush the larynx or obstruct the breathing, in which case you can hear sounds, but there's no audible speaking. What Eric Garner suffered was he was brought to the ground, and 4 or 5 really large policemen probably stuck their knees in his back, compressing his lungs, in which case he wasn't able to breathe. And every time he said, "I can't breathe," their weight further compressed his lungs because he was expelling air. I've been in a similar situation in training where 2 or 3 guys are on my back, and believe me, when somebody's wrenching back on your head and you got people on your back, you can't breathe. And so that, with his weight and his asthma, caused him probably to die. The question is the violence and the overwhelming force that they used, but not the guy hanging on his neck. The guy on his neck was offering a blood choke and just trying to control his head. Really didn't kill him, in my opinion.
Interesting.
Really interesting perspective, and also
Yeah.
interesting because the other officers who testified, my understanding is who testified about that, were granted immunity. So it's interesting that the focus has just been on the one who did the chokehold, and maybe not the others who were part of that. I think the question that viewers of that video, though, will continue to ask is, why is a man who said, "I can't breathe," why did that process continue?
Yeah, 11 times. And the medical examiner, of course, ruled this a homicide and did point to both the chokehold and the fact that they were pressing him into the ground, as well as his other complicating
Indeed.
health factors as causing his death.
All right, let's go to Susan in Toledo, Ohio, for another perspective. You're on the air.
Oh, thank you very much, Diane. I guess what upsets me and concerns me is I don't hear people crying out for respect for the police officers. When police officers take these jobs and they run into these situations, they tell these people, "Put your hands up" or "Get down on the ground." Why are they not complying? What is happening in this country to the respect to the police?
Margaret, do you want to comment?
I mean, I do generally think that's true. If forget about the morale of listening to the police or respecting the police, just as a matter of self-preservation, it's just not smart to defy a police officer. What's different, I think, about the Garner case is he wasn't aggressively resisting. He was saying, like, I can't breathe, you know?
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, he was
he
sort
did.
of complaining, you know, guys,
Exactly.
you guys are hassling me, but I don't
Right.
think it's a crime to complain that the police are hassling you.
But let's make sure to say he was illegally selling these individual
single cigarettes,
cigarettes.
yes.
Yeah.
Indeed, and the caller makes a very fair point that it's very important to respect the police in cases like this, in any case, when you're approached by a police officer.
But isn't that part of the problem? Somehow police have lost respect because of incidents like these around the country. So what kind of training going forward is going to change
It does.
not only their attitude, but ours as well?
It becomes very circular, because if you are a resident in a community that's racially polarized, where you feel that the police don't respect you, then you're not going to treat the establishment with respect if you think that the establishment's out to get you. And these just become self-perpetuating cycles. You know, when the law enforcement community doesn't reflect the residents of the community, you just have a baked-in problem that sets up conflict from the get-go.
And just the fact that you have bystanders feeling like they need to videotape something like that, or other actions with police, also raises that question about the breakdown in respect between both sides.
And the sense that police officers in some of these cases seem to be above the law, and that's a problem.
There's one other problem here, which is that the young person who was with Michael, who the young person who had the camera
With Eric
has
Gardner.
been charged.
Well, and that's, again, I mean, that's why. And
He had a gun.
He had a gun. Mhm.
He had a gun,
Yeah.
and he has now been charged. So, I mean, boy.
No good deed goes
I know. Here's Sean in Deerfield Beach, Florida. Hi, you're on the air.
Oh, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
Diane Reed. My question is, these are body cameras that they are talking about. I'm pretty sure the grand jury saw the movies,
Right.
the pictures of what was happening. So what are body cameras going? What difference the body cameras going to show what they already seen? And he still, that was the same case in the Rodney King situation in California. They seen the movie. So what's the big deal about the police having body cameras? It seems like they're going to take the police's word for this any given situation anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about body cameras is there are essentially two arguments for body cameras. One of which is that it would help if you have if a civilian has a complaint against an officer. But it also the other argument is that it would help police prove that they aren't guilty of some sort of wrongdoing. So in this case, it looks like this video helped the police prove that they acted correctly.
And there is the
in
third
this incident.
argument, which is the one of sort of self-censorship, that if you know that what you're about to do is being videotaped, you may hold back a little bit, which for police officers, I would imagine they're not entirely comfortable about. You don't want to feel like restrained before you get out of the box. This is supposed to be part of President Obama's political solution to this, which is to say, I'm taking action, I'm doing something. The problem is that now in the wake of the decision on Garner, it just sort of exposes the body cameras as a measure, but not exactly the sort of
a
measure
Band-Aid
that deals
measure
with the
in some
problems.
ways.
One really interesting statistic, and I referred to this just a little bit earlier, that in Rialto, California, complaints against police officers fell by 88% a year after these body cameras were put in place in 2012. So there are some statistics so that they're useful and at least in that way. But I think, as both of you have said, it can help both the police and the people who are being prosecuted.
So you don't think that, I mean, you're going to have conflicting videos, perhaps one from one angle, another from another angle.
Yeah.
Indeed, but there still seems like a strong argument for at least having the technology available.
But by the
question
time
is-
you're going to the video, something really bad has happened.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. I think Judy Kay would like to talk about something else. She's in Dallas, Texas. Hi there.
Good morning, Diane. Good morning, panel. Yes, I'm going to change the discussion, which is very good. Thank you.
Thank
About
you.
immigration. In Texas, I don't believe if there's a bill on Boehner's death, why won't the Republicans take a vote on it? Because they know it will pass. I don't believe they want an immigration bill passed because they use it to browbeat everybody. And if you're a normal, moderate Republican who really is just a good guy or good gal, you can't say anything because they're such bullies. Even the Christians around here are kowtowing to these extreme conservatives, which we will talk at the legislation starts in Texas in January. They're talking about all these tax breaks and give it. Well, who's going to pay for Texas? What has happened to my great state?
I think it's a terrific question. I think it's one that the White House is asking as well, and I think it's one that the Republicans are asking themselves as well, because no matter where you stand on whether or not it's right the way the president proceeded now with his executive order, the truth is immigration is something that matters to a huge and growing important constituency in the United States for both political parties. And the president has laid down something that's going to help the Hillary Clintons of the world and other Democrats of the world in the next presidential cycle. The Republicans have to have some way of saying why they didn't vote on it in the House, or why they're not coming up with another solution that appeals to Hispanics.
Yeah, and if you look at the guts of what his executive order actually does, people pretty much agree with the effects of it. They don't agree with the process, but in terms of what it actually does, there's widespread agreement, and there's agreement from Republicans about certainly mainstream Republicans about immigration reform too. But that might not matter.
Might not matter. Here's a tweet from Blaine, who says double jeopardy does not apply in grand juries as there was not a trial. A second grand jury would restore faith. Please discuss. Have we ever had second grand jury examinations? of the same issue? Or does Blaine actually mean taking this to trial?
I don't know the answer to that, but I
Yeah.
think the point of his comment is very present in terms of the fact that so many people are upset about what happened and whether there should be a second try. And I think the political process is trying to give that second attempt at it as well
Yeah.
through the civil rights investigations. But the question of whether there can be another grand jury is not one that I can answer.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I do. Yeah, I think the Justice Department, that's the sort of second bite at this apple, and whether or not this officer will face any punishment from the police department. You saw, of course, in Ferguson, that police officer, Dan Wilson, resigned. So not sure yet if this officer, Daniel Pantaleo, will face some sort of punishment.
All right, and we'll have to leave it at that. Malika Henderson, Jeff Mason, Margaret Tulla, thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Diane.
Diane.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Diane.
and thanks for listening all. I'm Diane Rehm.
The Diane Rehm Show is